time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Russ Baker. Russ Baker is an investigative journalist. He is founder and editor-in-chief of WhoWhatWhy.com. He has written for The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, The Nation, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Village Voice, and Esquire, and numerous other publications. He has also served as a contributing editor to the Columbia Journalism Review, and he is the author of the book Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, The Powerful Forces That Put It in the White House, and What Their Influence Means for America. Russ, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
It's my pleasure.
So start out, tell us a bit about WhoWhatWhy.com.
Sure. After many years in journalism, I began to consciously note that there were topics I couldn't cover. There were depths I wanted to go to that I was unable to. And so I decided it was time for a new sort of journalism. Who, What, Why is a nonprofit. We are nonpartisan. I like to call it nonpartisan but fierce, meaning we really want to know what happened, what is happening, and what will happen, and we will go to whatever lengths we can to figure that out. We try to focus on what we think are the biggest stories facing humanity. We try to focus on stories that we think other news organizations will not touch, either because it doesn't fit their particular orthodoxy or because it is just a little bit too sensitive for them. And so we've been starting Who, What, Why kind of gradually for a number of years, you might say, and it's been growing terrifically with a combination of staff and volunteers. We're on the web at WhoWhatWhy.com. We're technically at .org. We don't take any ads, don't take any corporate money, and we rely, I guess, like this station, entirely on our audience.
How do you select your staff and writers?
Complicated formula, I would say. We look for people who think outside the box, who are more interested in learning than they are in opining. We look for people who are very intelligent and well read, but also go into every single story with an open mind. And so we've got an interesting mix. I mean, certainly on the journalistic side of what we do, meaning the actual writers and editors, they tend to be people who have been professional journalists, although we find that a lot of the best people were not professional journalists. They may have been biologists or chemists or almost anything, lawyers, and they bring the skills of that particular discipline to the stories. And so we've got, I think we're kind of an amazing experiment, which is, I don't think has been tried before, which is to, it happens in radio, let's say, in shows like this, but in sort of print journalism or online journalism, it is rare to give that kind of an opportunity to people who have not been formally schooled in it, but who really have a natural instinct.
And so they might also not necessarily be socialized as much as, let's say, a lot of the corporate media journalists are.
That's right. And so they're often willing to kind of look at stories in a different way.
All right. So one of the subjects that you have been focusing on for just a year now, because we also are just seeing the anniversary of, is the Boston bombing. So talk about that, maybe for those who can't remember specifics on it, kind of give us an overview and then.
Sure. Just to set the context, at Who, What, Why, we look a lot at the security state. We look a lot at the growing role of the military-industrial complex, to use one classical term. We look a lot at the role of fear in our society, in government, in what we are told we need to be concerned about. We look a lot at propaganda. We look at budget priorities. We look at changes in textures, say, for example, the militarization of our police. rollback of privacy and civil liberties. These are very important to us. And I've, throughout my career, covered the CIA, to some extent the FBI, and so forth. And so I've always been interested in their activities. And with the Boston Marathon bombing, that fit a pattern of what I guess you could call sort of major traumatic events that cause fundamental changes, many of which we don't even notice at the time. And in the case of the Boston Marathon bombing, it was this sort of astonishing lockdown of a major American city, people ordered to remain in their homes. And although there was a brief flurry of commentary, there really was no vigorous discussion about what was going on. Was this justified? Was this legal? And where could this kind of thing be headed in the long run? And so we began right from that first week in April of 2013, looking at the Boston Marathon bombing, trying to understand really everything about it, including why it was that the authorities were so keen on assuring us that they had solved this crime so fast and that there was nothing else to look at. And over the years, I've looked at other major events like Iran-Contra and Watergate and the assassinations of major leaders from John F. Kennedy to Martin Luther King, and have always been struck by the certitude of particularly the FBI in assuring us that they immediately knew who had done it. And, you know, it's that old saying, nothing to see here, folks, move along, move along. And we were troubled by that. We're always troubled by that. And in the case of Boston, we began seeing anomalies, Mike, right from the beginning, things that didn't add up, stories that changed. This is kind of a theme at WhoWhatWhy. We see so often, we see it with the death or the purported death of Osama bin Laden, the way they said, we threw the body in the ocean, nothing to see, no, nothing to look at, that's it, no, we can't show you photos, the video feed went out, so the people in the White House couldn't see what was going on, you can't talk to people who were involved. This is very, very common, and to, I think, an open-minded person, it's very suspicious. It's not really normal, and the Boston bombing is just an astonishing, I'd call it a kind of a deep politics event in real time. It's a case of the security services immediately creating a narrative, almost a kind of a mythology based on inadequate investigation. It was very, very clear to us that they really had not investigated all the possibilities. And the other interesting thing is the way that the key witnesses in all of these situations, you'd think you'd want Osama bin Laden alive and to interrogate him. You'd think that extraordinary efforts would have been made to just capture both of these brothers and get them to talk. But in what happened in the Boston bombing case was the first brother was killed. The second brother, it looks like an attempted kill because he was unarmed and they fired more than 100 shots into the boat in which he was hiding. And then a third fellow, a friend of the elder brother, living down in Florida, being interviewed by the FBI and then shot and killed unarmed again in a room while being interviewed. So we find these things important, and we think that they need to be carefully investigated.
So let's stick on that subject for a bit. Talk about what incidents or items really set you off in terms of asking questions. One of them is the lead guy that so much is based on his testimony.
I mean, basically, in most of these stories, we don't really remember how it came to be that we know what we know, but we think we know what happened. If you ask most people, they say these two brothers, the Tsarnaevs, did it. We know that they planted the bombs. We know that they made the bombs. We know all of these things, and we believe that they confessed. And so it's very interesting that I talk to extremely intelligent, educated people who tell me that, I've seen video of them planting the bomb, but actually we haven't seen video of them planting the bomb. And there are tremendous leaks from law enforcement, which themselves are very, very suspect because there's an upcoming trial of the younger brother. These leaks are highly improper. They're unfair, and they prejudice the public and really the whole legal system against the defendant, which is not the American way. So we were told all these things. There have been leaks saying, that you can see them putting the backpacks down. They've released some stills. We'll have some things to say about that on Who, What, Why as to the reliability of those photos. They haven't released video of somebody actually putting it down. But one of the key elements in there, I think what you were referring to, Mike, is that we are told that several days after the bombing, the FBI announced at 5 p.m. on Thursday of that week, the bombing was on a Monday, they suddenly put up stills from video, and they said, these are suspects or persons of interest. If anybody knows who they are, please let us know. We don't know who they are. So it came out sometime later that the FBI did know who these people were, and in fact had been interacting with the elder brother for a while, several years earlier, as a possible terrorist suspect. So it struck us that they were very quick to say, we don't know who these guys are, and it took the Russians in a very strange situation. The Russians said, well, you do know who they are because we warned you about them some years ago, and then the FBI was forced to then admit that it had actually interacted with and been dealing with and been in and out of the house of Tamerlan Tsarnaev. But then sometime later that evening, suddenly we heard police officer down, there's shooting, and there was a dead police officer at MIT. We were quickly told that it was probably these brothers who had done it. That gave me a little bit of a chill of recognition because in my work looking at the Kennedy assassination, it was a similar situation where you could not really connect Lee Harvey Oswald with the shots fired at the motorcade. But then shortly after that, a police officer was shot somewhere else. They said that Oswald had done it and that he had dropped his wallet. It was all very, very neat, and then this pointed him back to the fact that he worked at the book depository. In this case, it was almost identical, and we were told that they had shot this police officer. We've looked at that, and there are real doubts as to whether they would have had the motivation, whether they would have been in that location, or what evidence there is. But even more interestingly, later that evening, we heard that there was a carjacking, and that the victim escaped, ran across the street from one gas station to another. Police and FBI were on the scene literally in several minutes. They were very fast to respond. And we are told that this carjacking victim explained to them that he had been carjacked by a man who was later identified as Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and he said that the man not only had a gun, which you'd think would be sufficient motivation to do what he said, but that he actually said to him, do you know who I am? I am the bomber of the Boston Marathon, and I also just shot a cop. Now, that just struck me as a little bit odd because if, in fact, Tamerlan Tsarnaev's purpose was to lay low and to get out of town, adding that element to the fact you already had a gun just seems extraneous. And so we were interested in this so-called confession because this is the basis for the public believing that they definitely were behind these things. And we were struck by the fact that we've never to this day been introduced to this carjacking victim. They used a nickname for him, put him on camera without us seeing his face. Recently, they've started showing his face a little bit, but they still are not telling us who he is. And I tried through intermediaries to have access to him because I wanted to ask him specific questions about inconsistencies in his own accounts, and I've been denied that access. He did several media interviews early on. They were softball interviews. They didn't really attempt to elicit information from him. It was more of a kind of an affirmation of the official narrative. Softball, but his story is fascinating, Mike, because in different accounts, the length of the carjacking from an hour and a half down to 30 minutes down to 0 minutes. There are questions as to whether he said in the official account he was sitting in the car with one brother who had a gun and he bolted out of the car when the fellow was distracted. We found another account where he told a television reporter that he was alone in the car, that they were outside of the car doing something else entirely when he escaped, which makes you wonder how ruthless they were and how competent they were if they would just leave somebody who was a captive alone. And so all of these things raise questions as to what really happened and whether this story that we're being told is credible.
Tell us who is Jamie Foxx. He's one of the people you dealt with or tried to get an interview with?
Yeah, one of the stranger of many, many strange things on this story is the fact that this fellow nicknamed Danny has been sort of mentored or guided, and his media interviews sort of controlled and monitored by a professor of criminology at Northeastern University. And I was struck by the fact that, to me, a criminologist would be mostly interested in the crime and solving it, but this fellow seems mostly interested in sort of protecting the identity of this witness, and even kind of intervening in the interviews and sort of steering them. And I found that to be strange. Let me put it this way. I get the feeling on a lot of these stories that the security complex of this country is much larger than we understand, that academia, that all sorts of institutions, people within the media play roles in this. And if we look back historically, there has been such cooperation. On our website, WhoWhatWhy.com, I think it's still on the front page, an article by a very good journalist named Steve Weinberg, a review of a book about the FBI and its the cooperation of the media with the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover in crafting essentially a false image of the FBI for public consumption, creating this notion of this sort of invincible, highly competent, extremely principled outfit, which actually bore no resemblance to the truth at all. And so we see in that book the extent to which media figures were like PR people for the FBI. And on the Boston story, we see John Miller of CBS, a guy who himself was, the head of public affairs for the FBI, and then he goes in and out of journalism, and he's the guy sitting there interviewing this Danny and just lobbing softballs at him. So there are real questions about academic figures and institutions, places like MIT, where this police officer was shot. MIT actually sent me a letter and told me to stop asking people questions on campus because they said it made people uncomfortable. And I thought, that's an institution of higher learning and higher inquiry. Well, MIT takes a tremendous amount of money from the government, very closely associated with large corporations involved in the so-called Homeland Security and the war industry.
Talk a little bit about some of what you find are problems with the story around Sean Collier.
Yes. So that was the shooting on Thursday night. That's when all these events began happening very, very fast. And I believe that was the moment that this sort of potential myth was being created, this sort of certitude of that it was just these two guys. They were lone wolves. By the way, we're always told that people are lone wolves, except in cases where they want to create a kind of an exaggerated international conspiracy, like with the idea of making al-Qaeda more than it may actually have been or be. But in this case, we were told initially that this very brave police officer, first responder, had shown up at a convenience store and or gas station and run into these two brothers and that they had shot and killed him. If you ask the public now, many people heard that. People, it's sort of that first impression that stick with people. One of my favorite sayings is a lie gets around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And so those first impressions are absolutely critical in what they call PSYOPs, psychological operations, to shape public perceptions. And then later on, after people were not paying much attention, it was like, oh, well, no, that report was wrong. He actually was shot while in his police car. And then it came out, well, he was sitting on this street in Boston, and they came up to him and shot him and took his gun. And then it turned out, oh, well, somebody shot him, but they didn't take his gun. And then I discovered that he wasn't on a street, that he was parked between buildings on the darkened MIT campus, and it wasn't near where they were, or there wasn't any clear reason why you would be on a darkened campus, or even know that a police officer would be sitting in a police car between darkened buildings. I mean, that's not normal on campuses. And then they told us that he was there because it was routine that he would sit there and prevent people from making illegal right turns. And I went there, and there was no place there to make illegal right turns, and there was no traffic at that hour. So that clearly was just bogus. And the media has not followed up in the kinds of issues we've raised at WhoWhatWhy. They read our stuff, we know, because we hear from them, but they, for whatever reason, they cannot seem to ask a single good question of the authorities.
And talk a bit more about the friend or relation that was shot dead by the FBI in Florida.
Yeah, so there was a fellow named Ibrahim Todashev who was a friend of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older of the two brothers alleged to be behind the bombing and the shooting of the police officer. And he lived in Orlando, Florida, and as soon as the FBI and the Boston State Troopers discovered his existence and the fact that he was maybe the closest person with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, they were on a plane down to talk to him. They brought him in and had a number of interrogations. He was uncomfortable with what was going on, and he told a friend that he felt that they were trying to force some sort of information that was not even true to get him to say some things, to possibly even confess to something. He had a sense they were trying to figure out what he knew about the Boston bombing, what he knew about Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and even what he knew about Tamerlan Tsarnaev's past dealings with the FBI. That he felt that there was some sort of a mop-up going on, and they interviewed him several times. The final time they interviewed him, he told a friend that he was scared that something bad was going to happen. He asked a friend to come over and be there at his apartment. The FBI kept him outside, and eventually made the friend leave and go to a restaurant somewhere, and they said, "We'll bring your friend when we're finished." Against regulations, there was only one FBI agent in the room. They are supposed to always be true because the FBI has this very strange thing where when they extract confessions, they never tape record. They never film. Very odd, very anachronistic, but they always have to have an extra officer there to supposedly witness this. And so in this case, something supposedly went wrong. He confessed to involvement in a triple homicide involving some low-level drug dealers in the greater Boston area some years earlier, and that he supposedly confessed that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was involved. But then apparently right after giving them this confession, he supposedly went berserk and lunged at them, and the FBI agent shot him and killed him. And it's all odd because they're trained, if somebody comes at you, you shoot them in the leg or you apprehend them some other way. It's all a very, very strange story. They told multiple versions. They leaked and they kept changing it. What happened, that this fellow came at them with a ceremonial sword, that he came at them with a baseball bat, that he grabbed, I think it was the leg of a table. And then later we find out, they make a big deal of the fact that he did Y Crew martial arts, but we later find out that he just had serious knee surgery and he was hobbled. We later find out, look at the crime scene photos, a pool of blood heading toward a hallway, not even where the table is, which kind of looks like he may have been heading toward the door when he was shot. And so all of these things raise very, very serious questions about whether we can trust what the FBI tells us. And of course, historically, we know that in the FBI's internal investigations of hundreds of shootings of people by FBI agents, in 100% of the cases, they said they were justified. I mean, that can't be true in any situation.
So the inevitable question and challenge would be to a lot of people listening would be, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. Why aren't you a conspiracy theorist?
Well, first of all, I would love to study that term, and in fact, I have. That term was suggested by the Central Intelligence Agency as a tactic to discourage discussion of particular topics. This was in the years after the Kennedy assassinations, plural. And there's a lot of discussion. There was a man working for Barack Obama, a Harvard professor, who was very big on discouraging people from discussing and speculating. He had this idea that they should have cognitive infiltration of chat rooms and online discussions about these kinds of deeper issues where people are suspicious of governmental statements claiming that these things are very, very harmful. And so there is a deliberate attempt to I would say, pejoratize and minimize and divert attention from people who make serious inquiries into these kinds of things by trying to sort of lump them in with people who may be nuts. And it's a broad and an unfortunate term. It doesn't actually even mean anything, because the term conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory relates to conspiracies, which is two or more people working together, planning and executing some kind of a crime. It is a criminal category that is being prosecuted as we speak in thousands of cases. The FBI routinely accuses people of being conspiracists. And so a theory is how we think about things. So conspiracy theory is how we think about two or more people getting together to commit a crime. It's a completely a non-judgmental term that has been turned into one that, when applied to anyone, is intended to just end conversation. It's kind of like saying, I don't know if you want to invite that person to the dinner party. She smells. And it's really a very problematical thing that we need to look at every time somebody uses that term.
All right, just about 2 minutes left. So you had mentioned that you're working on other forthcoming articles related to the Boston Marathon bombing. What can we expect coming out here in the near future?
Yeah, we're going to have more articles on that, I hope, every few weeks. It's very time and labor intensive. It's very difficult investigative work. It is the kind of thing that we pride ourselves on. It's the reason I created WhoWhatWhy.com. It's the reason I wrote my book, Family of Secrets, which I spent 5 years on, investigating the rise of the Bush family, consistently relevant now with Jeb Bush making noises that he's going to run for president as a third Bush. You got a fourth Bush. Jeb's son has just been elected to office in Texas. What do these dynasties mean? What are their relationships to the 1% of the 1%, the military-industrial complex and the CIA and the banks and so forth? This is the kind of things that we look at. We welcome people to come to our site, to read Family of Secrets, to become involved in whatever way they'd like to support our work. We're a tax-deductible nonprofit. We've got a Twitter feed at WhoWhatWhy. We've got a Facebook page, WhoWhatWhy. We're going to stay on this story. We're going to stay on as many more stories as we can within the constraints of what is possible.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you very much.